Şimdi sırada yine bir keynote oturumumuz var. Crafting the Next Socio-economic Fabric başlıklı konuşmasını gerçekleştirmek üzere Nokia Avrupa CTO'su Sayın Azfar Aslam'ı sahneye davet ediyorum. Now we have another keynote session. I would like to invite Azfar Aslam, Nokia Europe CTO, to give his speech titled Crafting the Next Socio-economic Fabric.
Thank you for the opportunity here. I've got a quick survey to start off with. Any economists in the room? Nobody? Any strategists in the room? Oh, this is going to be so boring. So, but okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. We're going to talk a little bit about this networks that are going to be the socio-economic fabric going forward. But let me ask you this, in a quick survey here again, does anybody disagree with the fact that the telecommunications, the networks, the services that we provide are indeed a socio-economic fabric? They are the ones on which our society and our economies run. Is there anybody in disagreement? Because if you are, then we stop here and we talk about that first. Okay, hopefully not. So what is this next socio-economic fabric that we're going to craft out of here? Well, it starts with a bunch of market trends, the changes that are happening, not just in our industry today, but also in the adjacent industries, Industry 4.0. You hear a lot about the metaverse these days. You hear a lot of new services being coming and being transported on our networks. So when we look at all those things, we want to understand where are we heading as an industry, what capabilities do we need during this rest of this decade, and what are the benefits, not just for us, but for the society and economy as a whole. So I'm going to start off with this chart. Everybody's heard about the Industry 4.0, the benefit of the automation, digitalization in the industries. But we often forget what problem we are really solving in those industries. And in this chart, what I've got here is the economic growth rate, so not the GDP, but the rate of growth for the United States during the last century and parts of this century. So in these last 120 years or so, what we've seen is that a big ramp up until the 50s, and then the rate of productivity went down. Not the actual GDP, the actual rate of growth. So this is an interesting lesson from the history because we wondered if this is the problem we are solving when we were talking about the Industry 4.0 almost 10 years ago from now. And when we spoke to the economists, they kind of confirmed it's that part of the chart which is declining is what we're trying to turn around. Because if it doesn't turn around, the economies are not getting any richer, the countries are not getting any richer. When you look at other countries like China, Turkey, you are roughly 60 to 70 years to the right of that chart. And what we want to make sure in the context of Turkey is that it doesn't go down. It just keeps going up for the next few decades. So hopefully the big picture is clear. This is the problem that we started to solve when we went into the digitalization and automation of the industries. Well, what have we learned? When we talk about the utilities, it was about the big regulation changes at the start of this century, and also the new business models, but also bringing the efficiency into the utility organizations, utility companies, production, distribution, and consumption. It's happening already. We are seeing the results and the benefits of that. In mining, we went from improvements in extraction to the transportation of those raw materials so that there's no outage. And then the productivity improves for the mining companies. That's what we saw over the last decade or so. And then we come towards the end into logistics and manufacturing, where the error rates needed to go down to reduce the cost. Productivity goes up, the profits go up. And then when I see the manufacturing, the agility in the manufacturing, where you can maximize the usage of your investments by doing more production, again drives more revenues, more profits, greater productivity, not just for the companies, but also for the countries. When I look at the Turkish environment, the customers that I've met here, companies like the Arçelik, the work that they are doing in the arena of Industry 4.0, already shows that it is being proven here in the Turkish environment. So we don't have any doubt that the promise that this Industry 4.0 started with almost 10, 11 years ago, it is delivering its promises. But why does it matter for us? Well, the reason it matters for us is because of the demand that we are now getting in our industry, in our networks. the kind of services that we need to deliver to these guys, whether they're deploying edge clouds, campus networks, private wireless networks, or hybrid networks. And it's that demand that becomes part of shaping the next fabric, socio-economic fabric that we're going to talk about. There's no conversation these days that's complete without the metaverse. So here's our version and our belief set here that what we call the metaverse now, and I'm not referring to the Facebook version or the Meta version or the Microsoft version, it's basically a bunch of pieces coming together, but they ultimately do two things. One is human augmentation on the left, and the other is the digital-physical fusion. Now, why does that matter? When we talk about the human augmentation, it's all about improving our biological productivity in the sense that we can do more work, more tasks, better, more efficiently, whether it's the use of the exoskeletons or other new devices that we will have, that we will carry on ourselves. When we talk about the digital physical fusion, it's about things like starting with the digital twins to look at and train the staff on the new technologies and solutions, all the way to running the simulations of your operations environment before you do the network or the equipment upgrades. So this is starting to take real shape in terms of new demand that starts to be created in the campus environment, but also coming into the wide area networks. So when we talk about the metaverse from Nokia's perspective, there are three segments that we are believing in. One is, of course, the consumer metaverse, but it's the bottom one that is already happening for us. So in the last 10 years or so, all our engagements globally with the industrial partners, what it has shown is the adoption of the digital physical twinning for various use cases. So this use case is already quite advanced. We're seeing the metaverse actually required in the enterprise space, because in the pandemic, when we were all doing Teams and other video calls, what we lacked was the ability to do the whiteboarding with each other. And that's the piece that we require in the future for the hybrid working to be more productive. So there's a place for the meta-type services in the enterprise. And the consumer will happen when the right devices at the right price points will become available. So it's slightly a little bit further out from our perspective. So focusing on industries, going into the enterprise, and eventually getting into consumer. But again, why does that matter? Because there's a bunch of things that still need to be invented. New devices with new silicon architectures, how they will connect to the networks, and how we will support those services with today's technology, as well as how the technology will evolve during this decade. So that's another demand vector that we are looking at. Now let's come back to more here and now, looking at what's happening in the business as usual environment. So this is, as telecom industry, we're very used to dealing with the video, the cloud services, voice and data traffic. But what we're trying to show here is how that demand will evolve over the next 3 to 4 years. And there are two inflection points here that we're already seeing in European customer base. Of course, Turkey hasn't launched 5G yet, but you will see that too sometime soon. The first is in 2021, at the end of the year, roughly 80% of the traffic was still in 4G and 3G, but 20% migrated already to 5G. In just 3 years from there, we will flip that equation, okay? What that means is that there's a lot more traffic coming in because there's sufficient demand for those cloud and video services. What that has done is it has also led to an evolution of the networks across Europe in this fashion. And what you see the evolution this century is that we started with the GSM, 3G, 4G, and now the 5G launch. What we will see in 2025 is a lot more spectrum available, and by the time we get to 2030, we will have launched 6G. And that's also new spectrum and new capabilities becoming available by then. But the point here is that as this is happening, this is business as usual demand, we then need to add the metaverse, the Industry 4.0 traffic also into that demand function. And that's something that the industry needs to start to get ready for. And for that, what we're saying is that you need to make options, because if metaverse for consumer happens in 2030 instead of 2025, well, you don't need to build all the capabilities immediately. If the Industry 4.0 actually expedites and it brings more data and more new kind of services on your networks, well, we need to deal with that a little bit faster. So for each of those scenarios, and that's what they are, scenarios for new traffic and demand, we need to have the options ready as we build the networks. So when we go into the network's capabilities, what we see is that here are the 4 segments. Oops. The 4 segments listed over here. First, we start with the cognizant wireless. And what we see here is that today we have launched 5G in most of the European countries. Okay? We will get to 5G advanced in 2025, 6G 2030. What we also need to recognize is that it's the same wireless networks that will need to last up until 2030 and beyond. So we need to build in flexibility as we design and we deploy those capabilities in the networks. So the network architecture needs to be flexible. The products that we deploy need to be very flexible. In the adaptive fabric, what you see is a journey from 100G today all the way to 800G by the next few years. We've already launched some of those 800G capabilities. By the end of that decade, we're talking about terabits on a single wavelength. That is going to happen by the time we finish this decade. On the fixed side, we have the modularity to go to 25G very quickly, and then comes 50 and 100. What this is telling us, if you didn't follow a lot of those details, is fundamentally 2 things. The wireless networks and the fixed networks will get to roughly 100 gigabits per second by the end of this decade. 100 gigabits per second. So today's networks, after 5G launch, we are seeing a lot of 1 gigabit kind of services. With a millimeter wave networks, we are seeing 10 gigabits type of services. But now we're talking about 100 gig in both the access technologies. Now work your way backwards from that, how your IP, optical, and the rest of the core networks will need to evolve to deal with all this traffic that we talked about and the upcoming traffic in the next few years. What we do need to do is make sure that as we build these capabilities, the journey must include very, very high performance, because the cost is very directly related to the performance of these networks. They have to be trustworthy. They have to be flexible to be able to scale up and down no matter when the new demand comes in. And most importantly, in this particular decade, they need to be very sustainable. So we have a whole roadmap on how we go from the consumption today and how we bring it down over the next few years. So from Nokia's point of view, there's a bunch of things that we are doing to make sure that that happens. From the telecommunications service provider industry, there's a bunch of things that there need to happen, from the architectural choices and how you build the networks. Both coming together will help us get to those sustainability targets by the end of this decade. One party on its own will not be able to achieve that objective. When we talk about the building blocks, we often get a question, well, hang on, I'm a service provider, so I need to do things this way, or I'm focused on just the consumer and not the industrial customers. It doesn't matter from our point of view. The way these networks will be built, the flexibility that they will be built in with, is that we will have the business as usual demand taken care of. So this is your traditional consumer, video, cloud, voice data traffic. But we will also, at the same time, be catering for the enterprise use cases, the Industry 4.0 demand, as well as the new use case, which is the developers. So the developers are effectively the gateway to monetization of these 5G investments, because they bring 5G and other network technologies together with the operational technologies of the industries. I was with the MEXT organization this morning here in Istanbul. Very impressive to see how they have built the ecosystem of the players, of the industrial players as system integrators, but also auditors who can help the industries move from automation stages today to the future state of automation. Fantastic work, but without that glue of the developers, we're not going to get to that nirvana. So these are the demand vectors that we're dealing with. And then in terms of the network attributes, yes, they have to be open, because to work with these developers, we need to provide the APIs so that new services can be created. And we know for sure that we will not be creating all the new services by ourselves. It will be an ecosystem of developers out there that will help us do that. They have to be mission critical. You cannot have a socio-economic fabric of the future that keeps falling down. So the reliability, availability, and resilience of that infrastructure has to be extremely high going forward. It has to be cost-effective as well. And that's an interesting challenge, delivering very high performance, all that resilience, but doing that at roughly the same cost envelope as today. So when we look at all of these attributes, which I'm not going to go through individually, we start to build a picture of what this industry needs to deliver to the rest of the society, as well as the industries that rely on our industry to drive their own automation journey and digitalization journey. So finally, the way we build networks going forward would not be one service provider saying, I build it this way, I own everything, and I will continue to build in that way in the future. What we are seeing is predominantly 4 types of network buildings in the future. And they will all have a role to play in that critical infrastructure. One is the traditional communication service providers, and then we go to the enterprises and industries building their own campus infrastructure for their automation and digitalization use cases. That, by the way, is already happening all around the world. We're finding an interesting partnership with the web scalers, so the cloud providers, where they could potentially play a role of a network builder or application hoster for these services that we're talking about. And finally, we're seeing the rise of these neutral hosts. They're emerging pretty much all over the world again, driven sometimes by the cost constraints of rolling out fiber, tower companies, and so on. But we're seeing the same guys now appearing in the edge cloud discussion, and so on. So these are the 4 dominant drivers and players in the industry that will help build the network. And when you look at the top part of this equation and the bottom part of this equation, you can have any-to-any mixing. And what that then requires from us and from the telecoms industry as a whole is that flexibility, that no matter which way the world goes, we need to be ready to cater for that demand. Again, if the metaverse for consumer happens because somebody solves the CPU problem and the networking problem on those devices, sure. And it's at the right cost, absolutely, that can happen a little bit earlier. But if it does happen in 2028, we've got to be ready for that. And like I said earlier, if the industrial 4.0 traffic comes faster onto our networks, then we've got to be ready for that too. So I'm going to leave you with this thought, that the critical networks to drive the next socio-economic development will be based on the concept we just talked about, from the different demand vectors, business as usual, all the way to industrial to metaverse, in different ways of building those networks, not just the way we've historically done. And the final piece here is that there's a lot of uncertainty with all of those demand vectors. So what we are doing is we are building the flexibility in our products, in our solutions, so that we can adjust how the world would need to then cater for those demand vectors, whether you're talking about the Turkish environment, China, US, or anywhere else. So thank you very much with that, and I will leave you with that thought. Hopefully that was of some use for you in thinking about how the networks will be built in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.